Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary. Some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Did you know that Iowa was once home to an NBA team? The Waterloo Hawks were a professional basketball team from 1948 to 1951, and they remain the only sports franchise ever located in Iowa from one of the Big Four sports leagues. Back in 1948, the NBA didn't exist yet, but the NBL, the National Basketball League, did. The league was struggling financially, though, so Waterloo was one of the 4 teams added that season in an effort to gin up enthusiasm. Unfortunately, their efforts failed, and the NBL was forced to merge with their rival league, the BAA, to form a new league, the National Basketball Association, in 1949. Waterloo was one of the 6 NBL teams to make the transition and play in the inaugural NBA season. They were led in scoring that year by Dick Meehan, who averaged 14 points per game on 42% shooting, while Leo Kubiak was voted by fans as the Hawks' season MVP. Their home arena was the Hippodrome, which is a multi-use arena that is still in use today for other sports. As you can see, they were not an integrated team, and they voted against integration in the NBA's inaugural season. Ultimately, they finished the 49-50 campaign with 19 wins and 43 losses, missing the playoffs. But after its first season, the newly formed NBA contracted, and the Waterloo Hawks were one of 3 small-market former NBL teams that were ousted from the league after just 1 year. Waterloo, along with the Anderson Packers and the Sheboygan Redskins, then created another new league, the National Professional Basketball League. Financially, this new league was a disaster, and Waterloo was one of the few teams that didn't fold midway through the season. They ended up with a 32-24 record atop the Western Division. However, unsurprisingly, the NPBL folded after just 1 year, and there was no championship game, and Sheboygan and Waterloo, who led their respective divisions, both claimed the championship. And so, in 1951, with the end of the NPBL, the Waterloo Hawks were no more. They played 3 seasons in 3 different leagues, including the inaugural NBA season.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tim Hanlon, and this, of course, is Good Seats Still Available, our weekly sojourn into what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for finding us. If you're new to the proceedings, we'll grab a seat and buckle up for safety. And if you're a return listener, we thank you kindly for doing so. And we know that you've been telling your friends to come and check out the show and subscribe and follow us as you have so faithfully done. We appreciate it either way. And we are back to hoops this week with our guest, Tim Harwood, for no particular reason aside from the fact that we had this conversation about a month ago and we just haven't got a chance to publish it yet. So God forbid we do it here today on, I guess this is on Labor Day, September 1st, probably the earliest date that Labor Day can fall upon this year. And while you're enjoying the Jerry Lewis telethon this way, oh, wait a minute, that's not on anymore. Yeah, well, there's on YouTube. You can find the old clips. You can hopefully enjoy a little bit of background on a phenomenally intriguing team that was only around for 3 seasons. And it was in a different league in each season. But most importantly, in its second year of existence, the Waterloo Hawks were part of the brand spanking new back then, 1949, 1950, National Basketball Association. Yeah, the NBA. The Waterloo, Iowa Hawks were one of the charter franchises of the NBA. Hard to believe, especially given the fact that they folded in 1951, 1 season thereafter. But it's true, and it's all part of a fascinating story. We've done a little bit of investigation about the 2 major predecessors to the NBA that essentially came together, call it a merger, I don't know what it was. We'll talk about that. The NBL, the National Basketball League, and the BAA, the Basketball Association of America. You may remember that the NBL was largely comprised of teams that were in smaller markets, places like Sheboygan and Anderson, Indiana, and in the Tri-City Blackhawks, which were largely located in Moline, Illinois, which is sort of a part of a little metropolitan area there. And a lot of those teams emanated from a lot of the industrial league play that was very common in the early rogue and ragtag semi and somewhat pro environments for hoops back in the 30s and the 40s. The BAA, as you also probably remember, was much more of a, I guess you'd call it a big market sort of major league kind of dynamic. At least that's what the owners had in mind. With teams in places like New York, like the Knickerbockers, or Boston, like the Celtics. It's interesting, though, as we get into this conversation, that by most accounts, the quality of play in the NBL was actually better than that of the BAA, which made for some very interesting dynamics. In addition to, by the way, various playing environments and the crowds and the support for each of these teams between, say, a megalopolis like New York and a small little market like a Waterloo, made for very interesting dynamics for the players and the fans and the management and the refereeing and all that kind of stuff. But that was part of the heyday, or the beginnings, if you will, of this NBA thing. And it's fascinating to go back into time. Now, I mentioned that the Hawks did play in the NBA that first inaugural season, but the year prior, they were in the NBL, as were some of those other smaller teams that we sort of mentioned before. And frankly, a lot of those teams found it difficult in this reconstituted NBA to kind of hang on and make the economics and the mechanics work. So as we'll talk about, the last season of the Hawks, the third season of their existence, they were part of, I guess, a bunch of refugees from this NBA thing that were prior to in the NBL that was called the National Professional Basketball League. So after a year of the quote-unquote big time, if you will, in the NBA, teams like the Waterloo Hawks found themselves back into an NBL-like experience with this MPBL in 1950-51. And that, despite finishing first in that MPBL league, the Waterloo Hawks left this mortal coil at the tail end, or actually probably in the middle of that season. We'll talk about all that. But this is a story of small town basketball in the big time. This is the formation of the NBA, the teams that made it, the teams that didn't. And remembering, frankly, a basketball history of that's frankly a lot lost, as we'll hear in our conversation with our guest Tim Harwood this week. Of course, he wrote the book literally and figuratively on this team. He is the de facto historian, whether he likes it or not, of this club. And the book, of course, is called, well, I don't know if it's of course called, but it makes sense to be called, there you go, Ball Hawks, the Arrival and Departure of the NBA in Iowa. It was published back in 2018 under the imprint of the University of Iowa Press. It is available right now wherever you find good books. Got great ratings on it, and it's a tour de force. It's great, a great story about a forgotten team. That's what we like to obsess about here on this show. And you can find it wherever you get good books. Of course, if you'd like to help support our little show here, keep our lights on, and get the electricity continuing to help us pump out these shows each week, well, just go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com to search up this episode 410 with myself and Tim Harwood, Tim Hanlon with you. And you'll find a convenient link or two to Amazon, where you can get the book in either paperback or Kindle versions. And you'll likely get it as quickly as humanly possible. Probably no quicker way to get it than that. We appreciate you doing so. And hopefully you'll appreciate this conversation, wet your whistle, so to speak, and the appetite for more about this fascinating yet fleeting club called the Waterloo Hawks. Here's our conversation that Tim and I had about a month back. And just a quick note, this is also, Tim is the voice of the Waterloo Blackhawks of the U.S. Hockey League in the minors. And you'll hear it because he's got a voice for broadcast for sure. So we appreciate that, of course. And here's our chat. Please, as always, enjoy. I think you probably figured out our little quirky little reason for existing, and just how natural, right down the center of the bowling alley, a topic like yours and the book like yours is for a show like ours. Um, so thank you in advance for doing that and knowing that this was going to be a perfect opportunity. Um, for our audience, a little background about you before we get into the story of the Waterloo Hawks. And I'm going to guess that you've got some allegiance or relationship to Iowa, perhaps, as your entree, or am I projecting?
Well, at this point, I do. Not originally an Iowa native, but I've been here now for a couple of decades, and I work for the hockey team in Waterloo, Iowa, which is in the United States Hockey League. And one of the fascinating things about hockey at this level is that you're working with players who are, in a lot of cases, bound for college, but in some cases on to the NHL. So if you have some hockey fans in the audience, players like Joe Pavelski and Brandon Montour and Brock Besser have all come through Waterloo and played for the Blackhawks. And Waterloo, actually, you wouldn't necessarily think of this when you think of Iowa, but Waterloo has a hockey heritage continuously that dates back to 1962. So one of the things that has kept me here for a long time is the opportunity to kind of delve into that history, and that led into this project with the Waterloo Hawks basketball team.
All right, before we get there, though, a little bit about your broadcast career. How did you wind up where you are now? What's sort of the what got you interested? And you got the bug, and where you've been so far, and perhaps where do you think you want to go? Not only regionally, but also maybe sports wise too.
Well, my first job was out in central Iowa, and let me even go back a little bit before that. I'd gone to school at Valparaiso University, that great NCAA hockey powerhouse. Yeah, Valparaiso's never had a hockey team, but I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. Valparaiso's in the northwest Indiana, so sort of the southeastern suburbs of Chicago for practical purposes. Grew up in the western suburbs and was a big Chicago Blackhawks fan as a kid. This is pre the Patrick Kane, Jonathan Toews era. This is Dennis Savard and Steve Larmer and Eddie Belfour. And knew that I always wanted to get into sportscasting, was a big Blackhawks fan, but the opportunity to do some hands-on radio work as a student seemed to be at Valparaiso. And so I landed there, even though they didn't have a hockey team, and had to try to work my way around into it, and actually covered a lot of soccer, which was as close as I could get with easy access. And
do tell what teams? Minor league, college, what?
No, at the college level, and actually then after I took a job in central Iowa at the high school level, even though soccer in western Iowa isn't necessarily something that's going to draw a ton of attention, but talked the radio station into letting me go out and cover some games in the postseason. It was good enough, and I shared the audio with a few different people, and was very fortunate to get a boost from the broadcaster down the road in Cedar Rapids, who said, "Hey, this sounds pretty good," when the Waterloo job was open, and helped to land this job back in 2005, and I've been here ever since.
All right. Well, so you obviously had then plenty of time to kind of get a little bit of comfort, maybe a little bit of depth, a little grit under your fingernails when it comes to sports in Iowa, its various histories, when did you discover that the little hamlet of Waterloo was an NBA franchise for the first time, and how incredulous were you, or have you known this since you were a child?
Well, funny thing. So I was out working in central Iowa, and Waterloo was going to get a minor league basketball team in a league that I don't think exists anymore. Minor league basketball, kind of comes and goes in a lot of places other than the G League. It's very fluid. And there was a story that was on the Iowa broadcast wire about Waterloo getting a team and having had a team back in the 1940s, an NBA team at that. So it was out there. I know that it had popped up here and there in the Des Moines Register and in other media outlets on occasion, but I didn't know a tremendous amount about the Waterloo Hawks. But I did know that they had existed, and I had to give a presentation at one point at the National Dairy Cattle Congress Hippodrome. It was Blackhawks hockey related, but it was an opportunity to bring up that history of Waterloo basketball and say, hey, you all know that at one time many years ago, the hockey team played here. Did you know that Waterloo had an NBA team? And just crickets around the room. And by that point, I delved into Waterloo's hockey history. I felt pretty comfortable with the archives for the local paper. I'd seen a lot of microfilm over the course of time. And I thought, well, if people don't really know this story, I at least know where to find the details of the story. And so no one else was seeming to be coming along to write anything about this Waterloo basketball team. So over the course of a couple of years, I dug in and found what I could.
All right. Well, put this in a little perspective. Obviously, your knowledge now is pretty deep, and perhaps maybe unique, perhaps in the local area around this team and stuff. But put us in all this in perspective as to why even a place like Waterloo, Iowa, would even have a quote unquote top tier professional basketball team, because this is in the late 1940s where the beginnings of what is now the NBA was actually in tributary form at that point, right? So this is one of those branches, I think, that was kind of leading up to eventually becoming the NBA.
Yeah, the community of Waterloo was really in the right place at the right time. If we rewind back into early professional basketball history, there'd been a few different attempts to have, and I don't know if anyone actually would have ever tried to use this name, but essentially Major League Basketball. And they'd not been terribly successful nor lasted a long time. A lot of pro basketball by the Depression era was barnstorming. Really, the best teams in pro basketball were barnstorming teams who didn't have to play in a league, and they could go and find as many games as they could. And that was a arguably better way to make a living than to try to play in a league. But by the mid 1930s, there was a reasonably solid league that formed. They eventually took the name National Basketball League, which is probably something of a misnomer because it didn't include those big eastern cities that we associate with big league sports at the time. It was much more Midwest oriented. And in places like Chicago, for example, the league struggled. It was in smaller communities where it had success, places like Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and Fort Wayne, Indiana, and other communities of that nature, more of your mid-sized cities. And the league made it through the World War II era, which was tremendously difficult because you lost a lot of player personnel. You lost a lot of opportunity to travel with rationing that was going on at that time, but came out of World War II, and it looked like maybe prosperity would arrive for the National Basketball League. But at the same time, there was another league that also developed in all those big cities, the Basketball Association of America. And this is the origin of the New York Knicks and the Boston Celtics and the Philadelphia Warriors, and teams that were in those big cities that we really associate with major league sports, especially of the era. And there was an all-out effort by both sides to try to get the best players, to try to be dominant, and neither side was really very successful. If anybody benefited, it was the players themselves, because now you had two different rival leagues bidding for their services and trying to get them to commit one way or the other. They did still have the reserve clause, so once you were in, you were probably in that league unless you were willing to take on the potential legal consequences of breaking a contract. But this went on for a few years, from 1946 onward. And it was a fascinating history. The Basketball Association of America ultimately looked around and said, well, we can't get these players that are under contract away from the NBL. How do we do that? Well, let's swipe whole teams. And that's how the Minneapolis Lakers and George Mikan went from the National Basketball League to the Basketball Association of America. They also took the Rochester Royals, which still exist today as the Sacramento Kings, and the Fort Wayne Pistons made the jump as a team. They're obviously still in existence today as the Detroit Pistons. And that was really the opportunity for Waterloo to get in. There was a big venue. I made reference to it earlier, the National Dairy Cattle Congress Hippodrome, which could seat about 7,000, 7,500 people. By fortunate circumstance, the building already had a professional basketball court from another league that had failed after just a few weeks during the fall of 1947. And now you have this National Basketball League, which is already regionally oriented to accept a community like Waterloo, and that desperately needs teams to fill the gap from losing these other teams that had been really significant contributors. So it was the right combination of being in the right place with the right facilities, and ultimately with somebody in the form of a promoter named Pinky George. He was a former boxer, not a former wrestler, but a wrestling promoter who knew the community and believed that it could support a team. He happened to come into possession of a team that was based in Toledo and moved them to Waterloo. And suddenly in 1948, there's professional basketball in Waterloo in the midst of this Basketball Association of America National Basketball League battle for supremacy.
Yeah, and I think people also maybe look back and the BAA has gotten, it seems, as the NBA has, I don't know, sanded down the history, has gotten a lot more of the or origination kind of story and verve versus that of the NBL. But I think people have to remember too, and I know you discussed this a bit in your book, the NBL at the time actually had been around. I mean, the formation of the NBA happened in, what was it, 1949, I think, and the BAA had only been around for about 3 years or so, just literally kind of right after the war. The NBL had actually been around for a decade plus, like I think 12 years maybe. And it actually had started almost as a pure play kind of, I think it was called the Midwest Basketball Conference. And as we've talked about in other conversations on this show, a lot of the dynamic of that, at least at the beginning, was this notion of players that literally worked day jobs at places like Goodyear and Firestone and GE and these factories in the Midwest. And then they would play, if you will, at nights and weekends as, if you will, pro teams, right? So this corporate sort of dynamic is another sort of interesting reason as to why these teams, were sort of centered in and around the Midwest or so. But it's also really interesting because those places were not in big cities. They were in smaller towns. And I'd have to think they were supported like nothing's business, like nobody's business by these communities, because they had, frankly, some of the best players, even more so than the BAA, playing basketball in their neck of the woods.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly in, let me take Oshkosh or Sheboygan, Wisconsin as an example. They had tremendous support and backing. What they didn't sometimes have, that Waterloo did have, for example, a place like Oshkosh did not have a venue, and that was something that held the Oshkosh All-Stars back. So yeah, if you look at the rosters from those NBL teams, you see All-Americans all over the place, and just tremendous talent for the era. We could pick up just about any of those teams and find somebody who's notable. The name that jumps off the page to me from that era, Bobby McDermott, who's Naismith Hall of Famer and was a tremendous outside shooter for the era, and was one of those stars in that NBL era, among many. He bounced around and played for a few different teams over time. But yeah, you had the best players certainly prior to 1946, and you had some of the best players after the BAA came into existence, and really the best player, the most important player of the era, George Mikan, was playing in the NBL. He got his start with the Chicago American Gears, it was a corporate team, very much like you described, owned by, this will be a huge shock, the manufacturer of Gears. That was the company, the American Gear Company, made a lot of equipment for the Navy in World War II and had a tremendous basketball team because they absorbed Mikan and some of the other players from DePaul in particular, who that was excellent at that time, under the the tutelage of oh, now I've lost it now all of a sudden, Ray Meyer.
Oh, of
And
course. Only
yeah,
just him. Oh, yeah, of course.
yeah, yeah.
Like legacy and hugely substantial.
I was just coming
Right.
up with Joey Meyer, his son.
That's
That
all
was
right.
all I
Well,
could come up with.
the Myers. Yeah, that's okay. A lot of people, frankly, there's a whole generation of people who didn't even know Ray existed because of Joey's existence. So yeah, it's easily understood. Let me ask you this though. Okay, so how does Waterloo effectively get this team? I think you mentioned before um, about Pinky George. How about a little bit about background about him to kind of get us into how Waterloo specifically gets a franchise in the NBL in 1948. I'm just really curious as to like, because this is a guy who's doing all kinds of promotions and stuff in Iowa and places like Chicago and that kind of stuff, and not necessarily basketball at the time. So I'm just fascinated as to like how a guy like this, who I think seems to be kind of larger than life, if I'm not mistaken, gets to Waterloo with a team in a fledgling NBL.
Well, he's just well connected all over the place because of his work as a promoter and as a former boxer. And he didn't choose Waterloo immediately. It was even though it was essentially going home. He was from just across the municipal line in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where he'd grown up. But he looked around and kind of weighed his options, and I think he probably was leaning a little bit more towards putting the team in Des Moines. He'd come into possession of this NBL team that had been in Toledo for a couple of seasons, the Jeeps, and it hadn't worked out there long term. So it was going to move the team and wanted to put them in Des Moines, but could not get the kind of deal that he felt he needed for a venue. And was, again, very aware of Waterloo's past and support of sports. The Waterloo area had been very supportive of a minor league baseball team, the White Sox affiliate of that era, and had at one point, I believe it was the summer of 47, drawn 200,000 fans over the course of the minor league baseball season, which is really impressive for a city of, roughly 80,000 people. That's a huge number. And so with having a building that sat 7,000 people and being able to get pretty good terms for it, he brought the team to Waterloo in 1948, which was the last year of the NBL as a standalone entity before the merger the next fall.
Okay, so the Toledo Jeeps then are officially the origin of this team, or was it just a reconstituted open franchise after that franchise had kind of gone its way in 1948?
You can draw a line between the two because there were players that moved over, among them Dick Meehan, who was an All-American at Tennessee, and he would be among the National Basketball League's leading scorers in the 48-49 season. He came over. Actually, he and his brother had played together in Toledo, and they'd both been at Tennessee prior to that. His brother did not make the transition. Harry Boykoff was another player who'd originally been under contract with Toledo. He was a big star at St. John's during his college career and an All-American, big guy. Not quite, but very close to 7 feet, and really a big star when it came to bringing out fans. It was a name that people would have known in that era.
Okay, so there were some. So there is, if one was really trying to officialize this, indeed a break here that the franchise, even though it had a couple of players, this was not literally a continuation of this Toledo franchise.
I wouldn't characterize it as that. I mean, again, they had the rights.
I mean, you
to
and
the
I may be the only
contracts.
ones talking about this, but I'm just I'm really curious because I mean, it kind of matters, right? I mean, if you really want to get, but it's interesting though that the line is at least there's a dotted line there.
Yeah, again, they had the contracts for the players who they did bring over, and besides Boykoff and me, and there were probably, well, there must have been at least a couple of others. So, at the same time, there were a lot of new faces that suddenly became part of the franchise. Charlie Shipp is probably the most notable one. And boy, what an interesting character he is, because he had a long career in that era that you're describing, with the Midwest Basketball Conference that became the NBL, and was a really significant player. Bounced around, played in Oshkosh, and played in Fort Wayne, and actually ended up. I mentioned Bobby McDermott earlier. He and Bobby McDermott ended up in a fight on a train over a card game, and that's why he had to get shipped out and ended up as the player coach for the Waterloo Hawks. Then I don't, it wasn't the same year, it was the next year, as best as I remember it. And he's a player that, if you had the full complement of stats that exist for professional or even college basketball today, I think he would be regarded in a different light than, a player who's really largely forgotten. But keep in mind, they didn't have stats for steals at that point. He was a tremendous defensive player. They didn't have stats for really much beyond scoring. Field goal attempts and field goal makes and free throws, and that was about it. But that really did not do any justice to Charlie Shipp's career, and I just still wonder how he would be regarded now by the larger world of basketball historians if he had a little bit more number volume behind him.
Yeah, look, and I think this we've gotten into this before too, that the NBL and its predecessors kind of gets more of a short shrift from historians and Hall of Famer types, that versus, say, what the BAA kind of does. I mean, I think there's a whole tree of quality and stardom and unique play that happened in both the in the NBC and the NBL and all that stuff. And I think, we're talking about the merger with the NBA in a couple minutes, but that whole dynamic of that sort of, corporate teams evolving into some early version of pro at the time when the pro game was admittedly inferior to that of college, that people couldn't make full-time jobs out of being a pro, that kind of stuff. I think there's a lot of, frankly, it probably takes another decade or so for a committee to look back, I think, and maybe give it more its proper due. But I mean, I think the fact that we're talking about the Hawks probably will shine a little bit of light onto some of these kinds of players, like you're mentioning.
Well, that's the hope, and I'm sure that you come at this, and I'm sure a lot of the folks who are listening come at this from the standpoint of, tell me something I don't know. Tell me a story that I haven't heard before. And that's I love the idea of the Good Seats Still Available podcast for that reason, because those are, whether we're talking about sports, whether we're talking about anything else, those are the kind of stories I want to find and read about. So yeah, I'd like to think that there's a group of people out there that feel the same way. I don't know if they're the people that are going to make any important decisions about, who might someday go into the Naismith Hall of Fame. And unfortunately, I guess my sense is that, looking at other halls of fame that I have maybe a little bit better handle on, that the trend is not to go back and look for great stories from the past. It's to recognize people who are on the scene now or have been within recent memory, and people who can help to sell tickets because people who know their names already.
Well, you never know when this stuff comes around again. Usually it's about money or recognizing that logos could be put on new jerseys and that kind of stuff, or there's a 50th or a 75th anniversary or somebody unearths it. This is, we're here for rediscovery, I think. So as people might be listening to this show, whether it's in a couple of weeks or in a couple of years, we'll hopefully jog some memories and maybe some in further investigation. Let me sort of break this down, though. The Hawks really were a 3-year wonder, if you will, and it's interesting because they played literally in 3 different leagues in each of their seasons. Right? We're talking about the aforementioned NBL, and maybe we can get a little bit into that season, that first and/or, in the case of Pinky George, his only ownership of that season. The second phase, right, was the merger into the NBA, the NBL and the BAA. So by success and by happenstance, Waterloo gained entry into that. And then we'll get into the third season, which was a whole nother kettle of fish, because the NBA itself was also trying to figure out what it wanted to be as its first year got finished. But how about the NBL first season of the Hawks at the Hippodrome? Was it? I get it. I got the sense that it wasn't everything that Pinky George was hoping it would be, bringing a team back to his hometown area.
On the court, they were an average team. They finished fourth in a 5-team division. They missed the playoffs that year. They were a little bit below 500. I do want to actually go back and just mention just a slight addition to that list that you mentioned of 3 teams in 3 leagues in 3 seasons, or in 3 leagues in 3 seasons. Actually, there was a very brief stop by another league called the Professional Basketball Association of America, Professional Basketball League of America, the PBLA, which only lasted about 3 weeks in the fall of 1947. And this really it's relevant to Waterloo's story because it provides the court that the Hawks would eventually play on. But this goes back to the Chicago American Gears and their owner, Maurice White. Again, he had George Mikan, and he looked around at the NBL, who he was playing against with his players, and he looked at the BAA and says, I can do it better than all of you guys. I'm going to start a huge league that's going to cover most of the eastern United States. I think at one point he was talking about having 32 teams. It didn't start with that many by the time he actually got it up and running, but it spectacularly disintegrated after just 3 weeks. And this is how George Mikan ends up with the Minneapolis Lakers, because when Maurice White's league fell apart, the National Basketball League wasn't going to let him back in with his team. They dispersed his players, including George Mikan, to the Minneapolis Lakers. But that, again, it's relevant setting up Waterloo for the following season and putting the community in position to have a team. But
so,
yeah,
that's proverbially something I didn't know, right? So that's lost to history, right? Without investigatory diligence like you're bringing up there, because that's not just an interesting wrinkle. That literally has a through line to a bunch of stuff, including one of the greatest players to ever play the game, Mike.
Yeah, it's tremendously fascinating. There was a self-published book by a player named Dick Triptow. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I believe it's Triptow. He was a member of this Chicago American Gears team in the 40s that won an NBL championship with George Mikan. And so he writes a little bit about this in his self-published book, which is not easy to find these days. I was fortunate to find it at a library in the Chicago area and get the chance to go through it. But it was tremendous source material and just colorful information that you could only get from somebody who was there firsthand and had the firsthand experience of seeing these things develop. Yeah,
I'm holding a copy of said book in my hands. It's called The Dynasty That Never Was, and
that's wonderful.
Very much self-published. You're right, but this is exactly the kind of stuff, right, where a lot of these little nuggets are hidden, and AI ain't finding this anytime soon.
I don't know how many copies there are or were, but there can't be many.
All right. Well, there you go. This could be my kid's college fund right here. Let's. I doubt it that, but yes, but this also is an interesting dynamic, right? Because we're also talking about, and we've seen this in other sports and stuff. These early years before, a merger or some kind of solidification of something like the NBA in 49-50, which itself, even for first few years, was still a shaky proposition. But there's so much dissonance and feeders, right? And you're mentioning a 3-week-old piece that somehow just broke a logjam and just went right down the river, right? But this is I won't call it violent, but it's certainly very haphazard and or wild kind of beginnings, right? Of the fact that you could have a New York basketball professional team and a team in little old Waterloo, Iowa. It just is indicative of just how unbalanced and crazy all this beginning, quote unquote, was.
Yeah, for sure. And for the record, the folks in New York, at least the sports writers, didn't think it was a good idea. They thought it was ridiculous. I think that word actually may have been used, or some synonym was used on at least one occasion to talk about the New York Knicks playing the Sheboygan Redskins or the Waterloo Hawks or the Tri-Cities Blackhawks, which were based in Moline. There was a team in Anderson, Indiana that was actually very successful during that era and found their way into the NBL. Also was very successful in the World Professional Basketball Tournament, which was hosted in Chicago each spring. So, yeah, it was one of those things, though, that couldn't probably last. I know the Green Bay Packers have been around and they can trace their roots back to the origins of the NFL and can say that we were there when we were playing teams in Rock Island, Illinois, and in Duluth, Minnesota, and other places that are now long gone. But it wasn't going to be viable for these communities, I don't think, to stay in the league because those big cities that had the opportunity, the operators there didn't want to be in the same conversation with them. They thought that it took away from their brand. And maybe they were right at the time. Maybe there would have been some nostalgia if it had worked out for some of these places to stick around longer. But even bigger communities like Syracuse and Rochester, New York, and Fort Wayne, and we could go on and on. They all lost their teams eventually.
Yeah, you look at that with the map though, this NBL, right? But it's literally dominated by teams in the Rust Belt and the Upper Midwest and the Great Lakes and that kind of stuff. So from a competitive perspective and a regional travel kind of perspective, you can imagine how fierce some of these rivalries kind of were in these battles, and frankly, these towns or small cities, especially those that had some kind of root in the corporate league kind of dynamic, were probably very fiercely proud and boisterous in support of in support of their teams, which is arguably something maybe the BAA probably, kind of certainly didn't have because the arenas were bigger. It's a big city, a lot of other things going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Madison Square Garden at the time, for one thing, it did not host all of the Knicks games of that era. They played some of their games at the Armory, uh, but they could put together a much better crowd for a big time college basketball game as opposed to a professional basketball game. No doubt about that. The idea was that those owners and operators of big venues, whether we're talking about Madison Square Garden or Boston Garden or Chicago Stadium or fill in the blank, they needed other events to fill out their dates when there wasn't a hockey game, when there wasn't something else going on in the building. And so this looked like a good option, but it was not an easy sell because, again, as you alluded to, the perception was that the college game was better, and it certainly had very good coverage from the national press. And so they were trying to find a way to bring professional basketball up to the same level of interest, and it was not a fast process. It took time. It took some innovation that, didn't happen until later into the 50s.
How well supported were they in that first year of the NBL that you could tell?
Well, I know that there was at least one game when, if we're talking about the Hawks specifically, where they drew a near capacity crowd of something like 7,500 in the building that they have here. The National Cattle Congress Hippodrome was also known as Waterloo Auditorium. And that was for a game against the Tri-Cities Blackhawks, which were based in Moline. They had a player on the Tri-Cities team named Murray Weir, who was an All-American at Iowa. And as a result, everybody knew about Murray Weir in the state. And that was a big drawing card for that particular game. On average, the crowds were not that big. You're looking at crowds between 2,000 and 3,000 on average. They actually, from me as a guy who is involved in sports now and, has some sense of what people will buy tickets for. It's remarkable to me because they started most, if not all, of their non-Sunday games at 8:15 at night, which is way later than what would be typical now. Think about the hockey team I work for. We start our games at 6:30, and the baseball team in town the same. So, drawing crowds at really a different time, and I don't know the mechanics of that and why that was a good time or a time that they felt like they could draw the best crowd, but that's the way they played it in that era.
All right. How about what's going on with the NBL at the end of that season, which was their last, and Waterloo's position in that? Because it's important to understand, given that the NBL was hot and heavy with the BAA and what came out of that the next season. But I'm really curious as to where Pinky George's head was at. I can't believe that's a sentence. In terms of his ownership of the team, the prospects of a merger. You're alluding to a team that was kind of middling on the court and okay and the attendance figures. How does Waterloo, I guess, make the grade to get through the other side to when the NBA is announced for the following season?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, so let me try to do that.
Okay, alphabetically and in detailed paragraph form. Go.
Let's start with Pinky George. Pinky actually stepped away from the team before the season was over. His brother Andy was running the team because Pinky George was involved in, again, a lot of wrestling and boxing promotion, was not living in Waterloo, he was living in Des Moines. So his brother Andy was running the team. And eventually he and Charlie Shipp, the head coach, took ownership from Pinky, more or less just take this and run with it and go with God and hope it all turns out well. So Pinky had stepped away. The team was underwater when it comes to the end of the season. And this is really one of the other fascinating parts about the story, ultimately. They had some debts. They wanted to keep going into a new year, didn't have the operational cash to do it. And so they said, can we find some help? Are there some people out there who would want to get behind this? And they actually sold stock during the spring and summer of 1949 to anybody in Waterloo that wanted to buy it at $10 a share, which we should acknowledge is a little bit more than $10 today. But you could buy into the team. Anybody who had $10 and who could fill out the form, which was actually printed in the local paper, could get a share of the team. And that's how they got the working capital to keep going. They transitioned the ownership. Essentially, they paid the debts. So Charlie Shipp and Andy George sold the team, but basically just stepped out from under the debt that they would have otherwise had to have found a way to service themselves. And Waterloo's working through the summer of 1949 towards the new basketball season as a corporately owned, locally owned corporation with somewhere on the order of 300 odd shareholders in the community. Now, as far as the merger between the NBL and the BAA, and I would certainly use the term merger. I don't know if everybody would, but from Waterloo's perspective at the time, this was a merger of equals, ultimately. The BAA, the NBL. The BAA had the big cities. The NBL probably had more talent when you look at it man for man from the top down. George Mikan, of course, excluded after he and the Lakers had been swiped by the BAA. But really, the key moment in the summer of 1949 is as we're talking about player acquisition and new college players becoming professionals. The key group of individuals were all former Kentucky Wildcats who had gone to the 1948 Olympics. They were coached by Adolph Rupp there, and they brought back the gold medal. They had been tremendously successful at the NCAA level, and they were going to go and play pro basketball. And the BAA was going to do what leagues do. They were going to divide them up and send them their separate ways in a draft and give a boost to their struggling teams that had finished near the bottom of the standings, just, we're very familiar with. And the NBL came up with a tremendous play. The commissioner at the time was a guy named Doc Seymour, and he said, we will give you a team, the Indianapolis Olympians. You five will own it, and you get to make the decisions about it. You'll get to run the show. And they said, all right, we'll take that. It's a great offer. And that's what brought the BAA really to the table to merge the two leagues. Because again, the BAA had done a lot of things to try to draw in the top talent over the course of their three prior seasons, but they lost that recruiting battle for the prime players that were coming out of college at that time, that particular season. And again, rather than trying to fight through whatever future battles there might be when it came to recruitment, they said, let's get together, let's form one league. And it was, again, as the NBL teams and communities saw it, a merger of equals between the two. Ultimately, it would not work out that way in the long run, and what would become the NBA would have leadership that would find ways to nudge out those smaller communities. But that's how it came together from the perspective of the NBL teams.
Well, you kind of hinted at it too. The NBA's first year, 49-50, was that first season. Was really this hodgepodge, right, of big city teams like the Bostons of the world and the New York Knicks of the world, with a whole bunch of these Midwestern corporate heritaged smaller city kind of and frankly better players in aggregate, kind of dynamic. Now with a linchpin of this Indianapolis Olympians thing, this had to be an insane scene this first year. I mean, it's crazy enough to merge two leagues. It's crazier to have don't call it an expansion franchise. I mean, I guess the NBL, it was there, but they never actually played a game in the NBL. But a team at a scratch with the, arguably some of the best college players in the country, and the dynamic of big city versus small town and the travel and all that kind of stuff. It must have been insane.
They had an unbalanced number of games. They had three divisions, and so just think about that from a playoff standpoint. How do you figure out three divisions for playoffs? But they didn't all play the same number of games. I will say this, though. Everybody in the league played everybody else home and away. So the very first NBA game in Waterloo was against the New York Knicks. The couple of nights later, when they were back on the court, they played the Boston Celtics. My hunch is that those teams wanted to get the trip over with, and so they came out to Waterloo and some of the other Western stops and just got through it and then could walk away from it. And interestingly enough, too, they would play some pro basketball double headers. And I think teams would, the Big Eastern teams would find ways to get out of having to host these smaller towns on their home court. So, the Knicks might host a doubleheader where they're playing an Eastern rival, a city, an opponent that folks might look at and say, all right, Boston, Philadelphia, whoever it is, that makes sense. And then the team from Washington would also be at Madison Square Garden to play Waterloo or Sheboygan or something like that, so that they would not have to host that game. But yeah, it was a very interesting scene. And boy, the thing that, or at least one of the things that stands out to me about the time period, was doing this with the mode of transportation that was available.
Exactly.
Most of these trips were made by train. You weren't flying from New York to Denver. You were on a train from New York to Denver, at least in most cases. There may have been some teams that did fly, but the majority of teams would have been on a train. Or in some cases, I know there were some stories that I've heard from players or their descendants about Waterloo, driving to a place like Sheboygan, Wisconsin, which is, it's a little bit of a haul. It's 5 hours from Waterloo to Sheboygan in good conditions on modern roads. And can you imagine doing that with 2 or 3 station wagons full of guys that are 6'4", 6'6", and
the
crammed
nasty
in there?
Midwestern
Then you have to get out and
winter.
play a basketball game.
Yeah, and the Midwestern winter is not being helpful either.
Absolutely not. So yeah, you had the travel conditions as well, and so I'm really amazed as much as anything by the fact that these guys got through 60 plus games under those circumstances. And you think about pro sports now, and yes, you're flying coast to coast, and it's not easy either. But I think that the wear and tear must have been at least as significant, if not more so, in that era.
How was the team received in this second year, knowing that they were part of truly the only and the major professional basketball league now standing in the United States?
Well, from a media perspective, there was certainly a lot of enthusiasm from the local paper. It was a great story to be able to tell, to say that, we're playing New York and Boston and Philadelphia and all these big league cities that have Major League Baseball teams, and that are the important communities that we look at and where the news is made. I think that there was probably a fair amount of enthusiasm in Waterloo, but there was also a certain amount of realism, both competitively and from the standpoint of a business operation, that Waterloo was going to have to do a lot to make this work. And it was going to be an uphill climb to be able to match up with, a team that had the kind of resources that you would expect from a place like New York. And I would also say this too: just because a club might come from a big city was not any certainty of success. The Chicago team in the era just barely scraped along. The Stags got through the season with a pretty good record, but financially they were a flop. And when it came down to it in the offseason the next year, for prestige reasons, the other clubs were trying to bolster the Chicago Stags and keep them afloat in ways that they never would have done for smaller communities. But if all else had been equal, they would not have drawn much sympathy from any of the other owners.
So from your perspective, what was going on at the NBA during that first season, besides just trying to keep everything going with now 17 teams across a varied geographical and time zone landscape? Did the new league and the ownership have it in for the small clubs early on, or was that something that naturally played itself out as things, went along during the course of the season? When were the knives out and the deed done to go from 17 to 11 teams that second season as the NBA, and leaving clubs like Waterloo and the Sheboygan Redskins and Anderson Packers in the lurch, or look on the outside looking in, so to speak?
Certainly by mid-season, there were some indications that the big cities didn't want to be in there with the small cities. And I think part of that was the media coverage that they were getting. There was at least one New York paper that had a column that suggested it was ridiculous that a New York team would be playing a team in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. There were some other things that I think came up in the media. There was a story in that one of the columnists from New York, and a nationally syndicated columnist named Hugh Fullerton, wrote about an anecdote that he'd heard about a referee trying to get to a game in Waterloo and having to hitchhike from a community that was along one of the main line railroads south of Waterloo several miles, and had to take a bumpy ride and wasn't sure he was going to survive the trip. And it may have been more of a story than anything else. It may have been for embellishment, but clearly there was not great PR from, having to match up with these smaller cities. And there were some things that even leaked out that were a little bit more serious by February about, owners or operators of big teams, wanting to try to find a way out of having to play with this other group of teams that they weren't really all that interested in, that didn't sell any tickets for their buildings. And it came to a head ultimately in the postseason, when they were trying to make plans for the following year and just looking for ways, technicality wise, to push out the smaller clubs. They at one point asked each team to post a $50,000 bond that they would play all their games the next year, and if they defaulted, then the league would get to collect that money. And to my knowledge, as best as I remember, that I believe everybody did. Waterloo and Sheboygan certainly did. Denver did. And and Denver is not the Denver of today. Again, it's much farther removed when you don't have the option to fly there, and you don't have another city that's closer than Waterloo, which must be by car 10 hours away from Denver, and that might be conservative. Um, so they were looking for ways to do this, and they were foiled at a couple of attempts. Again, they were trying to prop up a team like the Chicago Stags to keep them afloat while also trying to push out these smaller cities. And finally, they said, you know what? We're going to make the schedule, and we're just not going to include you procedurally. We're just not going to include you on the schedule, and that's going to be the end of it. And it was a majority vote because they weren't pushing out everybody. They still had the team in Indianapolis. And I think at one point, according to an account I read, those guys spoke up and said, wait a minute, this isn't right. And they said, well, you want to go with them? We'll send you too. And they didn't push out the team in Moline yet, but eventually the Moline Tri-Cities Blackhawks would move to Milwaukee and become the Milwaukee Hawks, and today the Atlanta Hawks by way of St. Louis too. So it was sort of divide and conquer, really. There were some of the NBL teams, a few of them, former NBL teams that got taken along. Syracuse was another one, and either weren't interested themselves in continuing to play the smaller market towns that were further west, or that were strong-armed into it. And you see Sheboygan and Denver and Waterloo all out. Anderson too. Anderson may have been on the fringe anyway. It was going to be tougher for them, from what I can remember, to put together the bond to guarantee that they would play, even though, again, they'd had a lot of success during the NBL era and even prior to that as a corporate team.
How does the deed get done then in Waterloo's case? And what are the options? I mean, is clearly the move to this, there was this other league that sort of kind of absorbed some of these smaller teams from these castaways.
Yeah, in fact, that was formed by the teams that got pushed out. Denver, Sheboygan, Waterloo, and Anderson formed a new league after they'd been set aside, and they had 4 other cities that they added in. Off the top of my head, I believe it was St. Paul, Louisville, Grand Rapids, and Kansas City. And they formed the National Professional Basketball League. So we just have this alphabet soup of league names, the NPBL. And so they said, we're gonna take you on, and sort of took the mantle of the old NBL. And the mindset was very much, when we were our own league before this merger, we were pretty competitive and had to make, the Basketball Association of America had to get very creative to try to win the professional basketball war. So we think we can do that again, was the mindset. And really the indication that they had a leg to stand on, at least, was that summer. Again, as we look at the players that were coming into professional basketball out of college, the NBA did get some of the best. They got Bob Cousy at that point, was coming out of college. But the NPBL, this new league with the cast-offs from the NBA, got the player that might have been considered the best among them, a big center from Bowling Green named Charlie Scher, who had been drafted by the Celtics. They had obviously not had a great season that first year of under the NBA flag. So the Celtics had the first pick, and Waterloo, because they had some other players with some ties to Bowling Green, and because they made a strong pitch, got Charlie Scher to come to Waterloo at the start of that season. And that was a sign that maybe the NPBL would have a little bit of fight. It didn't turn out to work out that way, though. And it was an attempt that was plagued by problems almost immediately. By just after Thanksgiving or so, there were already teams that were starting to stumble, and by Christmas, for certain, there were teams that were dropping out of the league, and they were trying to fill the gap with other teams. It became a really convoluted mess, because at one point, the league leaders said, we're going to only count games against teams that are currently in the league in the standings. No matter what your record is, you got to adjust it to account for these teams that have dropped out and that don't exist anymore. And that made just a huge muddle. And by the end of the season, nobody knew what the standings were. Waterloo claimed that they were the champion by one count. Sheboygan claimed that they were the champion by their count. And it just went down in flames ultimately by the end of it.
What are the fans sort of thinking once all that happens and stuff? I mean, it had to be, just an abandonment, right? You had 3 years of top tier professional basketball in our great small city, and in a flash, it's all gone.
Well, let me take something from the Waterloo Courier a few years later. In 1954, it was the centennial year for Waterloo. So the local paper had a big edition, several hundred pages about the history of the community and all of its different aspects. And I think probably something like 30 odd pages devoted to sports history. And so they took up that topic just a few years removed. And in their article about the Waterloo Hawks, they said the fortunes of pro basketball fluctuated. And even when the crowds were good, there was one difficulty or another, sometimes a losing season, sometimes mounting expenses, and sometimes strife within a league itself. Waterloo pro basketball fans always have insisted that the city would be in the NBA today, again, 1954, if the big city members had not forced out the smaller cities. So there really was a sentiment of disappointment, I think frustration, about what had happened among the people who were fans, among the people who were shareholders, who had invested in this either emotionally or financially or both. And I think that's why you don't see Waterloo, certainly at that time and even today, waving a flag saying we were an NBA city. We had Major League Professional Basketball. There are moments where it will come out and be referred to, but at that time, in the middle 1950s and onward, this was a huge disappointment. This was something that had been taken away, even though, as far as the community could see, as far as the folks who'd been running the team and investing in the team, as far as they could tell, they'd done everything that they'd been asked to do, and yet still was pulled away from them. So there was never much enthusiasm for nostalgia, or if you can have nostalgia after 3 or 4 years. There certainly didn't exist at that point because they didn't get to see it through.
Yeah, they were though they were there at the beginning, right? And I guess it has to stick in certain people's craws, not very many, I guess. When the NBA celebrates its, I don't know, 75th anniversary or whatever anniversary is coming up, right? And frankly, the whitewashing of a lot of the NBL stuff in favor of the BAA. As a matter of fact, I believe the NBA's official statistics have only recently gone back to now also retroactively incorporate the BAA, but not the NBL's stats, which to me seems odd, especially given this history that we've talked about. But they were there in the beginning, right? And it's how do you can't ignore that. If you're going to talk about the history of the NBA, it's important to understand the tributaries that led to its formation, its creation. And oh, by the way, that first season, there was a town called Waterloo that had a team.
Well, and there are actually several NBA franchises that would trace their roots directly back to NBL teams, which is kind of the disappointing part. But there's been so many moves for those teams that it's, if we're going to again talk about the Atlanta Hawks going back to the Tri-Cities Blackhawks, well, you have to jump back from Atlanta to St. Louis to Milwaukee to Moline to get there. And there's
right. And by the way, not Waterloo for those yelling at their devices, yes. Right? This is an asterisk for this. Waterloo is not a direct contributory to the current Atlanta Hawks franchise. It's really Tri-Cities that's where that came from. But I digress.
Nope, and that's a valid point because there were the Blackhawks and the Hawks who were both in the league together at the same time. And yes, that was even going back into the NBL year, where that was a matter of fact and perhaps a point of confusion for some people. But we could talk about the Rochester Royals, who again jumped from Rochester through several different hoops to become the Sacramento Kings with stops in, if I remember right, Cincinnati and Kansas City, and I may be forgetting one somewhere
Don't
too.
forget Omaha. Yes, they split.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
So, again, what's the incentive in Sacramento to play up a history in Rochester, New York? So I think that it's unfortunately kind of easy to look past that because I suppose if you want to celebrate a championship or something like that in franchise history, the anniversary of something along those lines, you could do that. But realistically, it's probably not going to be more than a relatively short game note or a brief mention within a broadcast. So just not much there to grab onto in the defense of those folks who are operating those teams now and who might want to rope in some of the history.
Well, that leads me to my last question, which for you, thankfully, is finally here. I'm sure you've been more than generous with your time today, this has been great. I mean, this is a fascinating set of circumstances about this. So, where does the history, quote unquote, officially live? The Hippodrome's still around. Is there any place, thing, banners, plaques, places of memory, and or is there a place maybe that could have inherited this history elsewhere, either in town or out of town or whatever? Where does this history live aside from this conversation in your book?
There's really very little. As far as artifacts, the most likely place you might find something would be the descendants of some of the players. I was fortunate to encounter a few of them and get the chance to look at some of the materials that they still had. Not much though, old game programs, and I've seen a jersey or two, but really very little that's still out there. The community has not, put up a plaque or anything along those lines. No signage. NBA started here or anything like that you'll see anywhere in town. There was an effort this last year or two that a couple of gentlemen from Waterloo originally who moved on and who kind of encountered the story in the same way. It was something that they weren't tremendously aware of. They embraced that, and they ran a basketball camp last Thanksgiving weekend and tried to get the details of the Waterloo Hawks out there to a new generation. And I commend them for that. They came up with a logo that it looks like a modern logo might have looked had the Waterloo Hawks existed in 2024 or 25. I think that might be where it goes. It's going to be a grassroots memory for people that like this kind of story, for people who listen to the Good Seats Still Available podcast. And I'm not certain that it will be, at least obviously, more than that for the time being. Maybe there'll be a resurgence of interest in the origins of basketball, like there was in the origins of baseball, as they went back and delved into the newspapers and compiled the archives for the late 19th century and put together Total Baseball and other materials like that. Maybe there'll be something like that comes along, but
When
at the moment,
yeah.
it's
Well, when
it's
you were doing your research, did you dare reach out to the NBA, or did you kind of just forget that and know that they weren't going to be very much help at all?
boy, it's been a few years. I don't remember reaching out to the NBA per se, to their PR office or anything like that. The NBA website, it was helpful for the 1949-50 season. As you alluded to, the stats, the official stats that the NBA keeps don't go back before that to the NBL years. So I don't think that there's a tremendous level of interest. I did send a copy of the book for what it's worth to Adam Silver, but I never heard back. So I don't know if he got it.
All right, let me then just wind up with this one then. So, I mean, it has to be a little bit disheartening, especially given all the research you did, and to know that there really isn't a whole lot, if much of anything, physical or rooted anywhere where the history, if you will, kind of lives or a repository for such. If you had your druthers, what do you think would be a fitting thing to remember and remind people of this team, either physically or in a place, so that it is truly not forgotten, and at least there's a place to focus one's interest or energies as people discover that there was this team.
It's a good question. It's a good question. I'm not certain where you could find the type of artifacts that, would make a good museum display or piece along those lines. What I will say about the legacy of the NBA and Waterloo, and I wrap up the book telling this story really intentionally. I mentioned Murray Weir several minutes ago in reference to his time playing for the Tri-Cities Blackhawks, again, the former Iowa All-American. Well, after the merger and after another year went by, Murray Weir ended up in Waterloo for the 1950-51 season, the failed NPBL year, and was still a crowd-pleasing attraction, and fans came out to see him. He was a undersized guy, and still just played the game like a wild man, and fans loved him for it. And he stayed in Waterloo after the NPBL disintegrated, and he went to work at Waterloo East High School. He was a teacher. He was the head basketball coach. He coached there he became the athletic director too. So including that time, he was there into the late 1980s. And around the time I was wrapping up the primary research for the book, Murray Weir died. He'd been retired then for several years. And I got the chance to go to the gathering of so many of his former players and students. And, it was really, really moving, the memories that they had of this mentor in their lives who would have never been here, never been in Waterloo, had not it been for that season with the Waterloo Hawks. So it's not tangible. It's not something that you could take the family to and walk past and take pictures of. But there is some legacy there from that, and the meaningful impact that he had on so many kids and all the things that they went on to do in their lives.
And also very interesting too, is one last point here, is this the actual arena is still around. What is that like? And you'd think that would be a place where there might be a little something like a corner somewhere or an old floorboard or something like that. But and I'm sure it's been rehabbed numerous times, but a rarity, right? Where an original arena still is actually standing in its somewhat original footprint.
Yeah, there can't be too many of those. Certainly not in use. I would compare it to, say, the Armory in Sheboygan, which is right on Lake Michigan, and which is and at this point I could be mistaken, but last I knew it was still there, but just teetering on the brink of being demolished and the space being repurposed. But the Cattle Congress Hippodrome is still in use. It's National Cattle Congress holds a fair every year, so it's a place where they would hold stock shows. They've held rodeos there. It was the home of the Waterloo Blackhawks hockey team for 32 years when they had done a renovation that allowed them to add ice making equipment. And actually, it has a relatively new sporting life starting last summer, even though the dimensions are a little challenging for what you might think of as a larger market arena football league at this level, in a relatively small market league known very descriptively as the Arena League. It has arena football now. So it does still exist. I do know that there were at least pieces of the court, if not the whole thing, that had been packed up into storage. And because they continued to use it, they played high school games there, and it was in use for a long time. Although I don't know if it still exists anymore, if it's been taken apart and scrapped. But yeah, the Hippodrome is still there, and it's of the 17 teams that played in that first 1949-50 season when they used the name NBA. Ooh, Madison Square Garden. And I'm not certain if there are any other buildings that are still left other than that, at least operationally.
All this very, very interesting. I mean, to say I learned a lot is an understatement, Tim. I'm glad I was able to discover this book. I know it came out, 2018 or so, and I'm sorry that I'm only coming across it now, but give us time. We do ultimately find these stories and um, these topics to cover, and I'm grateful that I think that you've become the official expert, I think, on this team, whether you like it or not.
I,
Um,
pre- I appreciate that, Tim. Thank you.
what can we do to follow you in your day job and stuff? Where are you on the socials, and where can we hear your dulcet tones calling games, either online or in person, all that kind of stuff?
Well, sure, I do fly under the radar on social media, which isn't great for a broadcaster or for an author, but
No, but it's noble, and it's understandable. So don't be too harsh on yourself.
well, yeah, it's the choice for better or worse. But yeah, certainly anybody that's interested in following the Blackhawks, we played for our league championship last year and went to overtime in the last game and came up just a goal short. But those broadcasts are available free of charge from our station website, 1650thefan.com. And new season's going to start here in no time. It's less than 2 months from the first home game. So hockey season's right around the corner, even though it was a 90-degree day here in eastern Iowa.
Well, I appreciate your passion for this stuff. Do you have any other projects in mind? Any similar deep dives into this kind of stuff, or was this enough of an exhaustive history lesson for you to to keep you away from further pursuits? I mean, anything in hockey, for example.
Well, like I said, I love this. I love this kind of history. I love stories that are out there that I don't know, but that people did know at different times in the past that were significant and important in their day, but that have just been lost. I've dug into the history of Waterloo on a couple of different projects. There was actually a team. So we're talking about the National Cattle Congress Hippodrome in Waterloo, which was the site of uh, these NBA games in 1949 and 50. The Cattle Congress and the Hippodrome go back at least another couple of generations into the early 1900s. And after World War I, starting in the winter of 1926-27, the local American Legion post had a hockey team there. And now I mentioned that they did a renovation to this building in 1962 where they added ice making equipment. They had a hockey team in this building without having an ice plant. They would open the doors and hope that it stayed cold and build up an ice rink. And if you were going to go to the games, you were going to sit there and it was going to be cold because it had to be. Otherwise, there'd be no game because the ice would be melting. And so they played this up until the Depression. And it was a team that didn't have any artificial ice. They didn't play in a league. They didn't have a set schedule. And yet somehow they still could draw two and three and sometimes more thousand fans to games. And it was all as essentially a fundraiser for veteran support and relief for the soldiers who had fought in World War I and who lived locally. So that was a really interesting project. Again, kind of just digging around and stumbling over it and saying, well, there's got to be a story here. And yeah, it was very interesting to dig through that and work on that project.
Yeah, I guess you got to do what you got to do. I mean, that's pretty amazing. And you got to look. I'm sure the weather at that time didn't didn't hurt the process. Just the fact though that I mean, it's almost just short of like why even have the game indoors then? Just take it outdoors somewhere, right?
Yeah, I suppose you might have blocked the wind. Yeah, that might
Sure.
have been an upside, and obviously seating helped to have seating, but no, it was fascinating to read about that and then to just find little nuggets. I was very fortunate that the American Legion Post, which still exists even though they moved a couple of times, actually had some of their old newsletters dating back to 1930. and they wrote about this team that was playing there, in addition to the newspaper accounts that existed. So, forgotten hockey in Waterloo that predated the team that's here now by 35 years.
I mean, where else are you going to get in-depth coverage about the Hippodrome and people like Pinky George than this here little show, huh? I mean, they're fascinating stuff. The Waterloo Hawks, fascinating, though fleeting, for sure. It's what this show is designed for. And we appreciate Tim making the time not only to be with us, but to write the book, literally and figuratively, on this team. It's called Ball Hawks, The Arrival and Departure of the NBA in Iowa. It is published by the University of Iowa Press, and it is available wherever you find good books. Of course, you can go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search it this episode numbered 410 with me and Tim, and you'll find convenient links to either the paperback or Kindle versions via our friends at Amazon, and we'll get some shekels of referral love when you do that, and we appreciate that to no end. You can listen to the dulcet tones of Tim Harwood during the hockey season. He is the voice of the Waterloo Blackhawks of the U.S. Hockey League. And you'll hear those games locally there at 1650 a.m. on the radio dial or 1650thefan.com. You can also hear Tim in the Waterloo, Iowa metropolitan area every morning with the KXEL Morning News with Tim Harwood. That's AM 1540 on your AM dial. I'm sure you can even tune into that online, too, if you want to hear them. And all kinds of great stuff awaits you on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Every stinking episode we've ever done, we post them there. You can search them up. There's a great search box there that there's a team or a league or a situation you want to see if we've covered. Chances are pretty good we've at least nibbled around the edges of it. You'll find it right there, that search box right there, right in the front as you're on the homepage as you type it in there. You'll also find our merch section. We had a lot of great stuff, including, by the way, this week, an awesome shirt featuring the original Waterloo Hawks logo on it from our friends at Defunctland. They are housed on tpublic.com. You'll find a link there on our website as well as in the show notes. And you can follow us on various socials. Go right ahead. You will find us on X at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Blue Sky at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find us just about everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available, all one word, including YouTube, where we stream every stinking episode of this show as well. So if you want to consume it there, by all means, please do so. And leave us a note or a thumbs up or both, if you don't mind. And by the way, wherever you can rate and review, please do that too, because that helps the algorithms, plural, out there do their thing to find other people like you who might be interested in this here little stuff. And we certainly love to spread that word. Our email address is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And one last note, the clip that set up the show there is an enigma in and of itself. It is the one and only clip from a YouTube handle called NBA History Pod. Literally, it's not even a video clip. It's a short. There's literally nothing else from that handle, NBA History Pod. But we thank her or him for doing it, setting it up and putting it up there, because that was the little pre-roll there, the little intro to this week's episode, and I thought it did a pretty damn good job. So hopefully there's more to come from NBA History Pod. If you're listening out there, we at least appreciate it. Hopefully you'll come to life with some more stuff. So there you go. All right, thanks for listening this far. We appreciate it. More stuff to come for you next week and every week thereafter. Hope you're enjoying the holiday weekend if you're listening to us the day we drop. And until next week, appreciate it. And we'll see you soon.